The 23rd of September 1942, the British Eighth Army was bleeding in the Egyptian sand. General Bernard Montgomery had inherited a broken force, exhausted men, rattled commanders, and a supply line stretched thin across 1,000 miles of North African desert. Rommel, the desert fox, was only 60 miles away at El Alamein. He could smell Cairo. He could practically see the Nile. Montgomery sat in his caravan and made a decision that stunned his own officers. He was going to wait. Not for a week, not for 10 days, for 40 days. He was going to rebuild the army from the ground up, retrain every division, flood the front with tanks, shells and fuel, and only then attack. His generals were incredulous. His corps commanders muttered. Churchill, back in London, was furious. He cabled Montgomery directly. The public needs a victory. The public needs army needs to move. Montgomery ignored him. Because Montgomery had looked at the maps, he had seen what everyone else refused to see. El Alamein wasn't just a position, it was the narrowest gap in North Africa, 40 miles between the Mediterranean coast and the impassable Qattara Depression, a salt marsh so soft it swallowed tanks whole. There were no flanks to turn, no way to go around. The only way through was through. And if you hit Rommel before you were ready, you would leave your bones in the sand, like every British army that had tried before you. So he waited, and while he waited he built. The plan he devised was called Operation Lightfoot, and it was an act of brutal arithmetic. There would be no finesse, no clever encirclement. Montgomery intended to smash a hole in the Axis line using sheer weight. More shells than Rommel had ever seen, more tanks than the desert had ever held, more engineers clearing minefields at night while in fields at night, while infantry advanced behind them. It would cost lives. Montgomery knew that. He told his staff without apology, "This will be a killing match. We will win because we can absorb the losses, and Rommel cannot." On the night of the 23rd of October, the guns opened up. 900 artillery pieces fired simultaneously. The noise was so immense that men 6 miles behind the line were knocked off their feet. The sky turned white. The desert shook. German soldiers later described it as the end of the world. The infantry went forward at 10 p.m. behind a rolling barrage. The sappers moved ahead of them on their hands and knees, probing for mines with bayonets. The German minefields were called the Devil's Gardens, 6 miles deep in places, 500,000 mines laid over months. A man who moved too fast died. A man who moved too slow let the barrage outpace him and left himself in the open. By midnight, the plan was already in trouble. The corridors through the minefield were too narrow. Traffic jammed. Tanks piled up behind infantry, their engines screaming. Unable to push through, the 9th Australian Division on the northern flank had hit an unexpected strong point and was taking casualties at a horrifying rate. In the south, the new South Zealand Division had broken through, but there was no one to exploit the gap. Montgomery was told his armoured brigades had stalled at the edge of the minefields. His chief armoured commander, General Lumsden, came to headquarters to suggest a pause, a recalibration, perhaps a night's rest. To reorganize, he explained carefully that the situation was complex, that the tanks were in a difficult position, that caution was warranted. Montgomery looked at him for a long moment. "You will push your armor through tonight," he said. "If you cannot do it, I will find someone who can." It was not a discussion. The tanks pushed through. They took losses. They emerged on the other side of the minefield, battered and disorganized. But they were through, and now the real battle began. Rommel, sick with a stomach ailment and back in Germany, was summoned back to Africa by a panicked phone call on the 24th of October. He flew through the night, arrived at his headquarters, studied the maps and recognized the danger. Immediately, the British weren't trying to break through cleanly. They were trying to grind. They were trying to grind, chew through the Axis army piece by piece, replace their losses faster than Rommel could, and collapse the line through attrition. It was Rommel later admitted exactly what he would have done. He launched a series of sharp counterattacks, probing for weakness, looking for the overextended flank that he could always find in a British army. He found nothing Montgomery had anticipated. Every probe, the British line bent and flexed, but did not break. Every Axis thrust was absorbed and thrown back. Rommel was using fuel. He didn't have losing tanks he could cheat, replace, and killing men he had no hope of. Reinforcing for 10 days, El Alamein looked like a stalemate. Churchill sent another cable. The press was asking questions. Senior officers in Cairo were beginning to worry again. Montgomery was unmoved. He sat in his caravan each night, studied his reports, made his notes, and slept. He had done the arithmetic before the battle started. He knew when Rommel would break. He knew exactly when the equation would tip. On the 2nd of November, he ordered Operation Supercharge. He pulled the New Zealanders out of the line, reinforced them with British infantry, and drove them like a fist at the weakest seam in the Axis position, a stretch of ground held by exhausted Italian infantry, who had been fighting for weeks without relief. The New Zealanders went through them in an hour. Behind them came the tanks, the 1st Armoured Division, unleashed into open desert, finally free. Of the minefields, Rommel looked at his fuel reports. He had enough for 30 miles. He looked at his tank strength, fewer than 90 running vehicles. He looked at his supply situation. No ships had gotten through in a week. And then he did something that nearly ended his career. He disobeyed Hitler rather than fight to the last man. As ordered, he began withdrawing west on the 3rd of November. He sent the signal to Berlin and then gave the retreat orders before receiving a response. Hitler's reply: hold at all costs. Not one step back arrived hours after the movement had begun. Rommel filed it, told his staff the signal must have been garbled, and kept moving. He saved his army. He lost the battle. He was never the same in Africa again. Montgomery entered the field at El Alamein 3 days later. He stood among the wreckage, burned out German tanks, shattered artillery, pieces, the detritus of an army in collapse, and allowed himself a small smile. He had taken no unnecessary risks. He had not been clever. He had been correct, which is a different thing entirely, and in war the harder thing to be. Churchill gave a famous speech. This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. The North African campaign would continue for another 6 months. Rommel would fight brilliant rearguard actions across Libya and into Tunisia, but the turning point had already happened in the sand and the minefields and the darkness of those 12 days in October. Montgomery proved something that military history keeps forgetting: patience isn't passivity. Waiting isn't weakness. Sometimes the most aggressive thing a general can do is refuse to be rushed, to look at the calendar, look at the map, look at the arithmetic, and say, not yet. Rommel called him the one British general I respected. Montgomery called Rommel a good general, The desert didn't care what they called each other. It only remembered who left and who stayed.